Okay, my name is Michael, president of the Newman Association. The Newman Association of Vancouver is a Catholic organization that promotes and cultivates the religious, intellectual, and social formation of its members and associates. It is named after St. John Henry Cardinal Newman, an Anglican convert to Catholicism whose life story of conversion and writings on the idea of university greatly inspire those working for the advancement of the liberal arts and the ideals of Catholic education, an inspiration that led to the start of the Newman movement around the world in the 20th century. Founded in 1940, the Newman Association extends the mission of the Newman Club of the University of British Columbia from the UBC campus to the wider community and brings issues of pertinence into discussion and dialogue through its activities in the local church. We are very glad that you can join us this morning. We will also be giving more information later on how you can join us and be kept posted of our events and activities. Our morning event will take place in a conversation format with guest speaker Jonathan Mantharp instead of a traditional lecture. We are hoping that this will be a more engaging form of discussion to deal with the sensitive topic of faith and freedom in China. You are welcome to ask questions through the Q&A button below. Please note that the chat function is disabled, and our host will select relevant questions from the audience mid-event onwards, time permitting. I would now like to pass on the Zoom floor to our question host, prominent figure himself, our very own intellectual chair, Dr. David Klassen, to present our guest speaker for the day.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, for that introduction. Very good. Just to let you know a little bit about our guest today, Jonathan Mantharp. He's joining us from the city of Victoria on the other side of the Georgia Strait from us. He's worked for all of Canada's major newspapers and news groups, as you might have read. He's been a foreign correspondent, a war correspondent, and an international affairs commentator for 40 years. He's been posted in Europe, Africa, and Asia, and he is now a full-time author and commentator on international affairs. In addition to his long career in journalism, he's undertaken special projects for a number of governmental and non-governmental agencies. From 1980 to 1982, he was part of a small team based in London to advise then Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau on the patriation of the Canadian Constitution. In the early 2000s, he was a member of the Canada-Japan Forum, advising two prime ministers on ways to broaden and deepen bilateral relations. He's written 5 books. I will just mention the 2 most recent books. Claws of the Panda, Beijing's Campaign of Influence and Intimidation in Canada, was published in December 2018. I believe it's gone on to become a bestseller. And just this July, he's published his most recent book, Restoring Democracy in an Age of Populace and Pestilence. Jonathan, good morning.
Good morning, David.
It's a real pleasure to have you with us today, a real honor. You've been posted in Asia, and I understand that for a time you lived in Hong Kong. Could you tell us just a bit about your experience reporting on events in China and your contacts in China?
Yeah, David, let me say thank you all for the invitation to take part in this event. And I should warn you a little, I had hoped to have more time at my disposal to really bone up on this topic, which I haven't followed as closely as I used to do for the last year or so. But a number of things intervene. So if every now and again I dive off to one side to scramble through the paperwork I've got at hand here to find some particular number or to get an accurate description of something that we're talking about, please forgive me. But anyway, thank you so much for the invitation. I really appreciate it. Yeah, my family and I, we were posted to Hong Kong directly from Africa in 1993 with the intention that I would be posted there in Hong Kong through the period of the handover in 1997. As you can imagine, it was something of a culture shock to go from a rather nice bungalow in the northern suburbs of Harare, get on the plane, and after a couple of stops, get off in Hong Kong and go to a rather tiny apartment on the 31st floor of an apartment block just off Kennedy Road in Wan Chai. It was a shock. There were other more immediate working problems too. My predecessor, of course, had reported on the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. And as a result of his reporting on that, and also of what he had written about events in Tibet, he had been banned from China. And so I arrived there unable to travel to the place which was sort of very central to what I was expected to do in covering Asia. My beat actually was much larger. It went from Afghanistan to the Dateline and from Mongolia to Tasmania. So it was a rather large beat, but obviously China was the focus. So it took me quite a long time to work out how to get into China and to develop some sort of working relationship with officialdom there. I eventually managed it after a few months, and I decided early on to, because they were keeping a very close eye on me and they were very sensitive about politics at that time, I decided just to focus on economics for a while and to stuff all the political stuff in the back of my memory to deal with later. And that worked fairly well for a while. I decided I wanted to keep away as much as possible from the new sort of booming cities of the South Coast and the East Coast, and from Shanghai and Beijing. And I wanted to travel as much as possible in rural and sort of small city. I mean, that means small city is 10 million people, small cities in China. And I managed that quite well. I found that getting away from the Gold Coast and getting into the hinterland was very informative in many, many ways. So I enjoyed that very much. And I managed to keep the sort of relationship with officialdom going reasonably well while we were posted there. We left in the end of 1997 and arrived here beginning of 1998. And I, after that, went back and forth to China quite a bit for a few years, and certainly to Hong Kong. But then the relationship soured with the relationship with officialdom, and they began refusing me visas. So I haven't actually been back for a little while now, but I still have contacts in there. I still have a pretty good stream of information that coming out of China on a daily basis. And if I need to know anything, I need to find some judgments on events, I have a good number of people that I can contact. So that's sort of a quick overview of my experience with China in the last 20 years or so.
Well, thanks for that, Jonathan. One little thing, you have Chinese characters under your name and your emails. What's the story behind that?
Well, that's my name in Chinese. It's my Chinese name. It was, I don't know if there are any Cantonese speakers amongst the people watching. It was given to me by a Cantonese friend of mine. It's a bit of an alliteration of my name, but only in the Cantonese dialect. And what it means, it's a rather lovely name, which is why I use it. It means using writing to achieve the mountaintop. And it's a bit like sort of Dances with Wolves, but it's I rather like it. So I use it. That's the history of that one.
Oh, well, glad to know that. That's really interesting. Could you start by giving us a very brief account of how religious practices in China were affected by the communists coming to power in 1949?
Yeah, well, I mean, as I'm sure many of you know, the history of religion is very individual in China. There was never, as I read it, there was never a sort of state religion in the same way that there was in Europe and indeed in other countries of the world. Instead, there was sort of Confucianism, And if one looks on religion, certainly in the past, in history, as part of a means of state control or state discipline or state ability to assert a sort of cultural unity. In China, it was Confucianism rather than religion that served that role. So all sorts of every religion you can think of has had a presence in China over the years. The Christians and Nestorians first arrived in China around 700 AD, I think. There's a lot of dispute about some of these dates. By that time, of course, Buddhism from India was already there. And then around the same time, Islam arrived. And there were periodic crackdowns on religion by some of the emperors, and then some of the others were more free and easy with it. I guess so far as Christianity is concerned, the major date was the arrival of the Jesuits at the end of the 16th and beginning of the 17th century. But again, they, after being established there for many, many years, they also were ousted. And really, you don't get Christianity making any firm hold in China until the Opium Wars of the 1840s and 50s, when the European powers, led by Britain at that point, insisted as part of the settlements of after the wars, the unequal treaties, as they are now usually and quite rightly known, insisted that as well as access to trade, they wanted missionaries to have access to China, and so you get Catholic missionaries from all over the place, from Canada as well as from Europe. You get American evangelists. You get the British China Missionary Society, and I mean, one of the features of them, of all this missionary activities, and sometimes there were 15,000 or so foreign missionaries working in China in the last half of the 19th century, was their singular lack of success in converting Chinese to Christianity. And so they did the next best thing, and they focused on education and public health. Many hospitals were built by these missionary societies. Indeed, in Chengdu, in Sichuan province, the capital of Sichuan province, which was a focus and was the center for the Canadian United Church missionaries, there is still the hospital that, I mean, obviously improved since then, the hospital built or financed by the Canadian United Church missionaries. And I believe that it's still the largest hospital in China. It has beds for many thousands of patients. And so most of those hospitals do survive, and most of that work does survive. But when the communists took power in 1949, they are, of course, avowedly atheist operation, but they didn't push out. They pushed out a lot of the foreign missionaries. They pushed over several years. They pushed out all the foreign missionaries, but their attitude towards the Chinese Christians was a little more subtle, and they created a number of state-run organizations to manage and oversee and control various religions. And there are 5 recognized religions in China: Buddhism, Taoism, Islam, and then Catholicism and Protestantism are dealt with separately. I think they perceive distinct cultural differences between Protestants and Catholics, and thought they were worthy of different administrative establishments. But the relationship has been up and down, very much so. during the Cultural Revolution from sort of 1962, 63, 64 to the death of Mao, 1975, all religion was banned and was repressed, including, of course, the more native religions such as Buddhism. I remember going a few years ago in northern Yunnan province in the far west. There's an area up there, it's a fascinating area around the city of Lijiang. It's a Nashi country. The Nashi are a highly individual people and culture. They are a matriarchal society. The women are the leading figures in society, or they were. Up in beyond Lijiang, there was a wonderful little monastery, which was being turned into a sort of cooperative to attract tourists, which was one of the reasons why I went to have a look at it. But it's called the Temple of a Thousand Camellias, and in the courtyard of this little monastery is a most magnificent camellia. But during the Cultural Revolution, the monks were forced out, and the temple was boarded out, and the monks were very concerned that the camellia would die, and so every night one or two monks would sneak in over the walls of the monastery to water the camellia, and so the camellia survived 10 years of the Cultural Revolution. But a lot of the architecture and the statuary in most temples, most churches in China during that period was defaced one way or another. It was a huge loss of artistic heritage at that time. When after the Cultural Revolution, when Deng Xiaoping began his reform, at least economic reform, and the advent of what we could call, I suppose, state capitalism, there was an easing up on the religious organizations, and there was also at that time a huge burst of enthusiasm for Qigong, which is sort of Tai Chi with sort of spiritual additions, and the authorities at that time allowed it to spread. I think they realized that while the country had been formerly communist, there was a sort of humanitarian spirituality to it, if you like. There was a sort of sense of spiritual satisfaction in promoting the humanistic elements of communism. But with that gone, with the economic reform, people began looking for other forms of spiritual satisfaction. And that, in my view, is what has driven the whole the expansion of religious observance of various sorts since then.
Yes, thanks, Jonathan. One of my questions was about that, whether there has been a rise of religion in China in recent years, and I think you've answered that, and also about the interest in religion because of the lack of what you call the spiritual dimension in communism. Is there any specific religion or type of religion that's risen in popularity?
Well, actually, yeah, as I said, Qigong, various aspects of it have been. I think that there's what has happened since then. I think there's a key date, and the key date is April the 25th, 1999. And what happened then was, it was rather interesting. The then premier, Zhu Rongji, had been in Washington talking to Bill Clinton about China joining what was then what is now the World Trade Organization. And Clinton had turned him down. On his way home, Zhu Rongji went to St. John's in Newfoundland. I flew over and latched onto his train there to follow him across Canada and listen to him. He went to Ottawa, then Toronto. And then he came here to Victoria and, of course, went to Bouchard Gardens. So everyone does. Anyway, after that, he flew home. I think it was got home on a Saturday, went to bed, and was woken up early the following morning, April the 25th, by a hammering on the door by his guards with the news that there were about 15,000 people gathered outside the tall red wall of the Zhongnanhai compound, the leader's compound. Zhongnanhai is the old sort of garden area of the Forbidden City in the center of Beijing. And it has been since 1949. They built villas around the lakes in there, and it's where all the big leaders of the Chinese Communist Party live. As you can imagine, security is fairly tight. Anyway, these 15,000 people or so were from Falun Gong, and they were protesting the persecution of their Qidong group, particularly in northern China at that time. And Zhu Rongji, who it was an interesting man. I rather liked Zhu Rongji. I had quite a bit of time for him. He wasn't some natural member of the Chinese Communist Party, which is why he didn't survive. I think he didn't have the murderous streak in him to allow him to survive very long. But if he was a superb economist, and he saw China through the early years of reform. If he had been allowed to survive and had gone on to become president and party leader, I think the story of China in the last 30 years would be a very different one. So he invited some of the Falun Gong leaders in to listen to their gripes. The problem was, of course, when the story got to other leaders, because this was April 1999, remember. It was just a couple of months before the 10th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. And security in Beijing was meant to be tighter than tight. And yet here were 15,000 people, middle-aged, mostly middle-aged, most of them sort of former middle rank party officials of one sort or another, who had come from all over the country, not just from the north, they'd come from all over the country to demonstrate outside the leader's compound, and no one in the security service knew anything about it until it happened. This really gave them a fright, and it reinforced the thought and the analysis that they had done after the Tiananmen Square massacre, that they must never, never allow any national organization to develop which could challenge the authority of the Chinese Communist Party and the one-party state. So they were really, really upset about this. In June, as I'm sure some of you will know, Falun Gong was outlawed. It was declared an evil cult, and has been persecuted beyond belief ever since. And that, I think, all that began the a new wave of persecution of all religions, and particularly the new Qidong organizations, but also the Christian religions as well.
Okay. Well, thanks for that. Good answer. Last month, the Vatican renewed its previous 2-year deal with the Chinese government. Could you tell us a bit about your knowledge of that deal and your opinion of it? And for example, do you think it gives the Pope a meaningful say in the appointment of bishops?
This has been going on for years, as I'm sure a lot of your members know. I mean, I remember it was an up and down issue all the time that I was living in Hong Kong. And it goes back a long way. I guess it goes back to some of the early Jesuit missionaries, Matteo Ricci and all these guys in the 17th century. The crux, there are two sort of real central elements to this whole business. The first one is the Communist Party's insistence that it must, at least, very least, approve the appointment of bishops. Now, I'm not a Catholic. I come from a Quaker family, so right the other end of the Christian spectrum from Catholicism. So I'm not the person to ask really about this. But from what I understand, as very much an outsider, this rather knocks the socks off the whole notion of apostolic succession. That if the sort of the line back to St. Peter gets rather distorted if you have officials of the Chinese Communist Party deciding who can be a bishop and who can't. So successive popes and Vatican officials have had real problems with this. But I think that some popes and some Vatican administrations have been more pragmatic than others. And I think that 2 years ago, when the agreement was, the interim agreement was made, the Vatican had come to the conclusion that it was, as long as they could keep reasonable control over who and had some say about the qualifications and acceptability of who was appointed bishops, that it was worth doing that if it provided a degree of safety and security and permanence for Catholic dioceses and communities within China, which is what was done. The other aspect, a far more political aspect, but a very important one, was the whole business of the relationship with Taiwan. At 1949, when the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan and set up shop there, the Vatican continued to recognize Chiang and the Nationalist Party as the legitimate government of China. They still do recognize Taiwan and have diplomatic relations with it. And they are now the only European administration, country, if you like, I guess the Vatican is a country, isn't it, that recognizes Taiwan and has formal ambassadorial relations with Taiwan. The issue here, I think, is whether Beijing is going to insist that a price for a secure relationship with the Vatican within China, within the People's Republic of China, must be that the Vatican ends a diplomatic and political relationship with Taiwan. I think the Vatican will resist that for many, many reasons, not least with there's a substantial and loyal Catholic community in Taiwan. And also, I think that there would be a lot of unhappiness and resistance amongst many other Catholic communities if the Vatican were to be seen to be pushed around that dramatically by the Chinese Communist Party. But you know, this is still a game in play. Another aspect about this, which is an interesting one, and some of your members may know far more about this than I do. When I was in Hong Kong, there was one of the issues that kept on coming up was that of the secret cardinals in China. And there's a phrase for it, isn't there? Cardinal in pectore, in the heart. It's and over many generations, popes had appointed secret cardinals whose names were not revealed. Cardinals who were working in countries where they would be persecuted if their identity was known. And certainly John Paul II, as far as I know, was the last Pope to appoint a cardinal in pectore in China. It was a cardinal in Shanghai. I don't believe that other secret cardinals have been appointed since then. I've seen nothing anyway to indicate that they have. But your members may know more than I do about that. But I think it's an interesting question about to wonder whether the Pope has and the Vatican has kept its own underground churches or underground cardinal-led establishments in China, out of the hands and out of the sight of the Chinese Communist Party. I don't know, but it certainly wouldn't surprise me if the Vatican had done that.
Thank you. Well, you mentioned the Vatican wouldn't want to be seen as being pushed around by China in regard to Taiwan. But speaking of the Vatican being pushed around, you're probably aware of the criticisms of the former Archbishop of Hong Kong, Cardinal Joseph Zen, of the Vatican-China deal, who doesn't think that the Vatican got anything out of it at all. I was wondering if how familiar you are with that and what your comment.
Well, yeah, I met Cardinal Zen a few times in Hong Kong, and he's a wonderful man. I must admit that I'm inclined to his view. He is a very strong supporter of human rights and of political rights. He has been a very strong defender of the efforts to gain and secure democracy in Hong Kong. And he's also a very, very strong critic of the persecution by the Chinese Communist Party of all religions in China, not just Christian sects and not just the Roman Catholic Church. And I think one of the things that drove his recent outburst was the persecution of the Muslim Uyghurs in Xinjiang province, where somewhere between 1 and 2 million are being held in concentration camps and are being brainwashed and reprogrammed. I mean, it's a most appalling situation that the world has not said nearly enough and not done anything fundamentally. I mean, it's just appalling in this day and age that a whole population of people is being subjected to brainwashing and reprogramming by an authoritarian state. And we've seen this all before. We've seen it before, and we know how it ends. For us to just sit back and without saying or doing anything much, I think is just appalling. And I think Zen felt similar things from everything that I've read that he's written and said about it. And he felt that for the Vatican to make a pact, a new pact, a renewed pact with Beijing at this time and in this climate was in his words, doing a deal with the devil. And I'm inclined. My inclination is to agree with him. I think the Vatican, clearly thinking much longer term, decided on a pragmatic approach, and the Vatican over hundreds of years has generally been pragmatic in its relationship with China. And I mentioned Matteo Ricci early on, and the early Jesuits. They got into trouble with the Vatican because they decided that a good pragmatic way to establish the church in China would be to adopt a several and central Confucian systems and approaches to Catholic services. They mixed Confucian systems in with Catholic liturgy and created a bit of a hodgepodge, which got them into a lot of trouble with the Vatican, but which I suppose made Catholicism understandable to then an essentially Confucian society. So this kind of pragmatism has a long history in China.
Thank you. Yes, I had brought to your attention an article last month of John L. Allen in Crux magazine.
Yeah.
And the United States had been critical of the Vatican's approach to China, saying that they were granting too much control to the Communist Party. And the response was, of course, part of it was that Allen said, well, the Vatican has boots on the ground personnel in China, and they have better knowledge than the American government of what's actually going on the ground. And secondly, he said that they're using a strategy of engagement rather than isolation and confrontation, and that with patience, small gains can produce big dividends.
Yeah, well, which is the pragmatic approach. I thought there was a good column, actually, and I thought his point about knowledge of the situation on the ground was a particularly good one. Now, he, of course, was responding, or the Vatican was responding to a speech by the U.S. Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. And as you say, Pompeo had criticized the Vatican for selling out to Beijing. I think a lot of the purpose or some of the purpose of what Pompeo said was to try to get some reaction from Joe Biden, who of course is a Catholic. And I suspect that there was mostly domestic political thoughts going on here rather than anything else. It would have been a small victory for the Trump campaign if Biden could have been edged into saying something which could have been portrayed as embarrassing to the Biden campaign. And also, I think that this was also playing to Trump's evangelical base of support. I think probably that the Vatican was simply a convenient target, but I suspect that most of what Pompeo had to say was aimed largely at domestic politics, and of course the Pope and the Pope's spokesman really sort of underlined that when they refused to have a meeting with Pompeo, saying that the Vatican does not get involved with or does not accept visits from leading politicians in countries where there are elections underway. So that was a convenient out for the Vatican, but also in many ways an appropriate one. Yeah.
Going back to the summary of the talk that you provided earlier on, you were giving particular attention to the current leader, Xi Jinping, if I pronounced that correctly, and you were saying that his attitude resembles that of Henry VIII of England, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Well, I think it does. It follows through from what I said earlier, that particularly after 1989, when the Chinese Communist Party senior officials went through a whole process of analyzing what had happened, what had gone wrong, and how they needed to address the future. They really isolated the imperative of not allowing anybody, any organization, particularly no national organization, to grow to a point where it could threaten one-party state and one-party rule. And to a certain extent, this was the dilemma faced by Henry VIII as well, that he had in the Catholic Church, of course, then so heavily under the influence of some of England's enemies in Europe. He had this sort of fifth column throughout the country, which he did not control, and so of course he did away with it. He created the Church of England. He dissolved the monasteries, which gave him huge amounts of land to parcel out amongst his supporters. So it was not only a governmental, administrative, and spiritual revolution. It was also a method of a very strong financial one as well. That's not the case, of course, in China. But I think that so far as Xi is concerned, his feelings and approach are very much the same as his immediate predecessors, just much more intense. This is a guy who thinks that the age of the People's Republic of China has come, that the United States is now a withering superpower, and that China soon is going to be the new paramount world power. And one of his imperatives is to ensure that nothing wells up underneath the Chinese Communist Party to disrupt this drive into the future. And so we have the suppression of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Part of that, of course, I mean, with all these things, there's always a pretty crude political purpose behind it. So far as the Uyghurs is concerned, some of the main roots of this Belt and Road Initiative, this multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure project to really make China the hub of a global transportation network of roads, rails, and sea lanes. So China is taking control of ports in Mombasa, in Ceylon, in Europe, and the port of Piraeus at Athens is now 50% controlled by a Chinese state company. And of course, they're building roads and rails through Central Asia, which puts the Uyghurs in Xinjiang in a very powerful position if they are not brought firmly under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. But it's more complex than that, because we hear a lot about the Uyghurs, but there are also a lot of Kazakhs who live in Xinjiang who are also being detained, persecuted, and brainwashed and reprogrammed. And this has set up a chain reaction in Kazakhstan, neighboring Xinjiang. And there have been many anti-PRC, anti-Chinese Communist Party demonstrations and riots in Kazakhstan. So the Beijing and Xi Jinping have not played this very cleverly. They have set up a whole load of suspicion across Central Asia and across the proposed routes of the Belt and Road Initiative. So, but fundamentally, the answer to your question is that Xi Jinping is following the same policies as his immediate predecessors, Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, but much more intensely, because he sees the rise of the new PRC global superpower as just on the horizon, and he wants to ensure that there are no domestic political problems to foil that effort.
Thanks. I had referred you, Jonathan, to an article by Anthony Clark in Catholic World Report, a recent article, and he speaks of a dilemma of Chinese Catholics being caught between two colossal leviathans competing for their loyalty. One tells them to be Catholic first, and one tells them to be Chinese first. Do you think he's correct in saying that China's emperors have always held that Chineseness supersedes all other identities, and that China's present rulers are really only maintaining the same traditional opinion?
I think that's right, and we know that here. I don't know how many of you have read my book Claws of the Panda about China's the PRC's Chinese Communist Party incursions here. But one of the totally unacceptable things that their agents are doing here in Canada, but also in Australia and in all the countries of the ethnic Chinese diaspora, and there are about 50-60 million people in that diaspora all around, particularly the Pacific Rim, but elsewhere as well. One of the pressures that are put on Canadians of Chinese heritage by the CCP and its agents is blood is thicker than water. You are Chinese first. And even if people have been Canadians for 2, 3, 4, 5 generations, they are still threatened, intimidated, and have pressure put on them by agencies like the United Front Work Department, the overseas Chinese organizations, in an attempt to get them to make their first loyalty to their ethnicity, to China, to the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party, rather than to Canada. And this, as I say, this happens in all the countries of the Chinese diaspora, and it is appalling. It is appalling. It is a totally unacceptable pressure put on entirely innocent people, and we should be pushing back against it very, very strongly. There's the Australians and New Zealanders and some of the other countries where this is happening are making a much better fist of this than we are, we should be responding far more forcefully than we do against this sort of rubbish.
Thank you. One question to follow up on that. David Mulrooney, former Canadian ambassador to China, says that Canada has been pursuing a diplomacy of silence with China and that has failed in the area of human rights and religious liberty. So would you agree with that? It seems that you would.
Yes.
Of the need to push back. What should the Canadian government be doing?
Yeah, I know David not very well, but I know him a bit, and no, his motivations are very pure on these questions. I think we have a real problem that the Chinese Communist Party has spent 60, 70 years infiltrating agents of influence into Canada and recruiting agents of influence here amongst our political, business, academic elites. And I mean, we've seen the results of all this in the Huawei affair and the detention of Meng Wanzhou. And of course, far more important for us, the detention in China of the two Michaels, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, who've now spent more than, I think it's 407 days today in solitary confinement. And the Canadian government just doesn't know what to do. They have been under pressure from these agents of influence amongst our elites to give in, to free Meng Wanzhou in the hope that the Communist Party will free the two Michaels. We need a very, very thorough re-examination from the ground up of what is a proper and productive relationship with the Chinese Communist Party. My own view is that what the Huawei affair has exposed is that we cannot have any simple, straightforward relationship with Beijing. Clearly, we share no values with these people. When their first instinct, when there is a problem in the relationship, their first instinct is to take hostages. We can't accept that. We share no civic values, we share no political values, we share no common view of international institutions, we have no security interests with China. Most other, or many other, Asian countries we do, and that's where we should be putting our efforts to build relationships with Asia. And we should just have a simple transactional relationship with the People's Republic of China, in my view. I mean, I was thinking about this morning, one of the appalling things, about the way that the PRC clearly felt that the detention of Meng Wanzhou, of the Red Princess, warranted the total destruction of the relationship with Canada. And I'm not sure we quite appreciated that yet. They are far more concerned about what happens to this one woman than they are about the relationship with Canada. And I think we should take note of that and say, okay, right, if you're not interested, neither are we. We're not that economically dependent on China. I mean, one of the things that the agents of influence have managed to persuade us is that we are economically dependent on China, but we're not. If you look at I saw some figures recently from the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, about it was a list of the relative dependence of various countries on their exports to China. We are 47th on the list. We're down with Togo and Vanuatu, something like that. The amount we export to China amounts to about 1.5% of our total export revenue. It's minuscule. Where the trade is dominant is the amount of consumer products that we import from China. That's where the relationship is, and that's of relatively of no benefit to us. Essentially, we can get those things elsewhere. So the notion that's been put around that we have significant economic dependence on China is nonsense. It's rubbish. They are our second largest trading partner, but they're actually third after the European Union. But they're our third largest trading partner because of what we buy from them, not from what they buy from us. So we can re-examine this relationship very hardly without any serious damage to our economy.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. I think I'll go to some of the questions from the
Sure.
from the attendees, and one of our members, I'll put forward a couple of questions from him. Is Christian worship openly allowed in China? Mm-hmm. And does Canada have any real advocacy influence on China?
Yeah. I'm sorry, I should have been a little more clear earlier on in some of our discussions. Yes, there are the 5 sanctioned religions, as I said, Buddhism, Taoism, Islam, Protestantism, and Catholicism, and all of these have their sanctioned temples and churches, these are everywhere. There are 394 dioceses in China. Now, of those, 74 don't have a bishop at the moment, but there are hundreds of Catholic churches and other churches and temples in China. There are services just as there would be here. The only thing, of course, is that the priests and the bishops are under the control of the Chinese Communist Party and its administration, and they are very circumspect in what they do. Often the services start and are required to start with the singing of the national anthem, and the homilies and sermons are required to follow Communist Party doctrine and thought. And often they're required to promote Communist Party objectives. So in terms of Catholic services in most other places, they are a bit of a sham. They go on all the time, they every day and every week. In terms of, now, there are, of course, in parallel, there are all what are called house churches, amongst the Protestants and Catholics as well. And these are communities that meet privately, that acknowledge the authority of the Vatican and of Rome, and it is here that we have often secret and unacknowledged bishops. Now, it is to try to sort this out that Beijing and the Vatican have been making these agreements, but they're still there for the time being. There are many more of them amongst the Protestants, and these services get raided pretty regularly, and people get detained, and if they're too adamant in their religious beliefs, they'll be sent away. The new social credit system tied in with artificial intelligence and facial and other recognition systems, using the 600 million CCTV cameras planted all around the country. This will keep records, does keep records of who are religious practitioners. And if they get out of line, they will suddenly find that they've tripped a switch in this social credit system. If they go to buy a ticket to get on a train to go travel somewhere, they will find the machine will not sell them a ticket. They will not be allowed to leave the city where they live. They will find themselves losing jobs and so on and so forth. And it's all automated. It's all automated. The CCTV camera system is by the most amazing piece of technological authoritarianism the world has ever seen, as well as having facial recognition. It has the ability to recognize people by their gait, by the GAIT, by the way they walk, and it can match those two together, and then depending what they're doing, it will add or subtract from their social credit. And so it's I think things are going to get more tight for people following religious observance in China. So far as Canada's influence is concerned, at the moment we have none. While we have our relationship with Beijing is in crisis, we have none, and I don't think we ever will again. You know, we're a relatively small middle power so far as the Chinese Communist Party is concerned. We've served our purpose in the 1960s and 70s in sort of running as a stalking horse for recognition from by the United States. They've pillaged our intellectual properties at universities and at companies with whom they've formed partnerships. Whenever a Canadian company has wanted to set up business in China, there's always been the requirement that they hand over their intellectual property as part of the deal. PRC now is becoming an innovative economy. They need less and less to pillage our technology. So our usefulness has really stopped. It's completed, and I don't think that we have any influence there now at all. And certainly not while the Huawei Mangwan Zhou affair is going on. We don't, not a thing.
Thank you. Another member has a couple of questions about the demographic change in China and about the numbers of Christians and Catholics. He's saying that in 1900 there were 4 million Christians, and he's wondering if there are 100 million Christians in China now, and how many of those are Catholics?
Yeah, let me. I'm going to just sort of go through some of my papers here and see if I can dig that out. Let me say there's no agreement on these numbers. The state tends to minimize them, and the religions themselves, the sects themselves, tend to inflate them. There are more Protestants than there are Catholics. See if I can find some numbers. Okay, here's the Pew Research Center estimated that in 2010 there were 67 million Christians in China, roughly 5% of the population. Of those, 58 million were Protestant, including both state-sanctioned and independent churches. Other estimates, so you've got then probably about 9 or 10 million Catholics. But other estimates say that they're now closer to 100 million, with unregistered churchgoers outnumbering members of official churches nearly 2 to 1. That doesn't surprise me. There are some other estimates which I've seen which go as high as 2 or 300 million people, Christians. So it really is a guessing game, but I think it's probably fair to say that there are 3 or 4 times as many Protestants as there are Catholics, whatever the overall number.
Thank you. Another question, somewhat related, is the Chinese diaspora really 2/3 Christian?
I don't know. I don't know at all. I haven't. That's a good question. I haven't seen any numbers on the diaspora at all. So I can't answer that. Probably a quick Google would probably tell you, but I haven't done it, and I don't know. I think that they're. No, I'm not even going to make a guess. It would be wrong for me to do so. I just don't know the answer.
I have another question from a member about the arrival of the Jesuits. Did the arrival of the Jesuits you mentioned coincide with the evangelist Matteo Ricci and his arrival and evangelism in China, and specifically the Forbidden City?
Well, he actually managed to, he and the other Jesuits, they managed to worm their way into the establishment pretty well and pretty quickly. I think the emperors of the time were intrigued by these characters. They came with quite a bit of scientific knowledge. They brought navigational instruments with them and so on and so forth. And this, I think, was intrigued the emperor and his court in Beijing, and as I say, they were very adept at tailoring their message to Confucianism and to equating Christianity as much as they could, and particularly Catholicism, with Confucianism very successfully. And you know, there was a significant Catholic and principally Jesuit establishment in the Chinese court for 100 years or so before there was a reaction. So and they traveled around China, around the region quite extensively. A few years ago, in the mid-2000s, I wrote a history of Taiwan, and going through all the papers and history of that period in Taiwan, Matteo Ricci turns up there, and particularly when the Dutch were there. The Dutch figured the Dutch had a colony in southern Taiwan. They figured he was a spy, but there was at that time also, there was a very small Spanish colony in northern Taiwan, and I suspect he was probably visiting there. So he was quite a significant figure around sort of Greater China, if you like, at that time, and he was watched by everybody. But he managed to ingratiate the Jesuits into the court in China very thoroughly at that point. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I have another question about the Vatican's deal with China, and one of our members is asking whether after that deal there's a greater threat to Christians, for example, in being more readily identified as Christians.
That's probably true. I think it probably is. Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the reasons why Beijing is pushing for this deal is to try and get the house churches and the semi-secret congregations out of the woodwork, and to know who they are and to be able to identify them, and thus to negate or attempt to negate any threat that they may represent to the one-party state. No, I think that's very true, and therefore it's a danger to them.
Another member has a question about the Chinese Gulag. Is there such a thing as a Chinese Gulag where Christians are being tortured?
I think that I'm not sure there's anything exclusive in the Chinese prison system for Christians. I think there's plenty of evidence that the most activist Christians, particularly those associated with the house churches and the private congregations, and in terms of Catholics, the ones who remain loyal exclusively to the Vatican, there is no doubt that they are being detained and disappeared and mistreated and so on and so forth, and sometimes even killed. But you know, I don't think that's not exceptional treatment in China. You know, our two Michaels, the first 2 or 3 months that they were detained, I'm not sure what the situation now is, but they were tortured every day with sleep deprivation and with hours and hours of interrogation. This is standard fare in China. You know, we've also, and I'm sure members have heard some of the horrendous stories about the treatment of Falun Gong people who have been detained. I mean, we've heard about them being used to harvest organs for transplants for a commercial business in selling organs on the international market to people who need transplants one sort or another. How true all the details of those stories are, I don't know. I haven't looked at them that closely, but they are just too persistent not to have a foundation in reality. But I think that I haven't seen any evidence, in fact, that apart from Falun Gong and apart from the Uyghurs, I haven't seen any evidence that Christians in particular are being persecuted more than anybody else. I mean, you fall out of line in China, you're going to have a hard time, and it doesn't matter what your perceived sin was. It's not a good place to get in trouble with the authorities.
I have another question from one of our executive members. He says, hi, Mr. Jonathan Mantharp. Canada is slowly but surely pushing back against China's threats and authoritarian policies post the Hong Kong national security law. For example, the lifeboat policy for Hong Kong Canadians, removing extradition agreement with Hong Kong. Feel free to answer these questions liberally. What else, in your insight, can or should Canada do in response to the Hong Kong security law? And with recent developments, the removal of the Pan-Democratic Party in the Legislative Council. That's his first question.
Yeah. Well, as I said, I think a bit earlier, I think we need to rework our policies and responses to the People's Republic of China, the Chinese Communist Party generally. Hong Kong is a particular one. I'll make a few general comments about things that I think we can do in a moment or two. But I think it's the groundwork with Hong Kong, of course, is that Hong Kong is a Canadian city to a substantial degree. There are at any one time about 300,000 to 350,000 Canadians living in Hong Kong. That makes Hong Kong, that has a Canadian population the same size as London, Ontario. You know, it's a big Canadian city. And also, of course, we have a responsibility to these people. If Hong Kong is going to go up in flames, we have a responsibility to protect these people. At the time of the handover in 1997, there was, of course, a good deal of uncertainty about how the Beijing administration would establish a relationship with Hong Kong after the handover. There were many fears, of course, that the People's Liberation would come over the border and create a military state. And Canada had at that time a disaster scenario plan for what to do for the then hundreds of thousands of Canadians in Hong Kong. I was shown the plan by a friend of mine who, and it involved the evacuation of 500,000 people from Hong Kong, 350,000 Canadian citizens and legitimate dependents. The plan, such as it was, and it was slightly farcical in some ways, because getting that 500,000 people out of anywhere is a major task. But this involved, Canada asking to borrow the entire U.S. Pacific Fleet and most of the Australian and Japanese navies as well. Now, there is a very similar plan in place now. I've heard of many of my friends from Hong Kong who are already quietly slipping out of Hong Kong and coming back to Canada. And I'm sure that we can expect that to accelerate over the next few years. But what can we do to protest? Well, we've done a few things, as the questioner implied. We've had some joint declarations with Britain and other allies. We have ended the extradition treaty with Hong Kong, and a few other fairly minor things. But I think that we should be taking a much more assertive position towards the CCP generally, not only over Hong Kong, but over Meng Wanzhou and the hostage taking of the two Michaels. I think we should be using the Magnitsky Act, which gives us the authority to place sanctions on individuals who we believe have committed human rights abuses. So we should apply the Magnitsky Act, which could apply sanctions on travel to the officials who we know have been involved in the kidnapping of the two Michaels. And we can apply that also to officials in Hong Kong who have involved in the promulgation of this new security law, and also now the expulsion of some of the opposition members of the legislature, and then the decision by the other members of the democratic movement to resign from the legislature. I think that we should look at applying sanctions. We should look at, say, withdrawing student visas of children of senior members of the Communist Party who we all know are involved in some of these decisions. We should certainly be very publicly exploring a trade relationship. We should be expelling known members of the United Front Work Department and the overseas Chinese organizations who are intimidating and otherwise attacking people here in Canada. We should be far more transparent about people who we know are involved in these organizations than we are at the moment. I'm thankful to say, I have to say, that CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, is becoming much more assertive about these kinds of things and is becoming much more willing to issue public warnings and public statements about what is going on here in Canada than they have been in the past. And that's to be applauded. I think that one of the main things that we can do is use transparency to shine the light on these people. Beijing has in Canada as many diplomats as does the United States. Now, the United States is our most important trade partner by a long, long way, and there are, the number of people, of Americans who live here, Canadians who live and work in there, and vice versa, is massive. And so it is understandable that they have a very, very sizable diplomatic representation here and a large number of consulates. There is no earthly reason why the People's Republic of China should have the same number of diplomats here. Many of them are two-hatted, or what is called two-hatted. They're not really diplomats. They're espionage agents who are here to work on people of Chinese heritage in Canada, especially those who are promoting political reform in Hong Kong or in China or elsewhere. And we shouldn't be putting up with it. We should be stomping on it, quite honestly. And those there are many other things we can do, but I mean those are the most obvious ones.
The same member asked another question. With all the decoupling internationally that we have been doing with China, is it reasonable to foresee that China would retract on their Uyghur detention and Hong Kong national security policies?
No.
That was a short answer.
No, but I think, you know, they are susceptible to embarrassment. You know, we have to remember, I think, that they are trying to build a picture of the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party as a benevolent organization or series of organizations that is going to be a boon to the world when the PRC becomes the world's superpower as they expect it to happen. I'm not convinced that that's going to happen, by the way, but that's another debate we can have another time. But so no, I think that that they are immune at the moment. But you know, there's a more important, or for Canada, an equally important purpose in staking these grounds at this time. You know, for the first half of our life as a country, we depended on Britain and the British Empire to have our back. For the last 50, 60 years or so, we've depended on the United States. But that seems to be coming to an end. You know, the US is going through an isolationist period. The internal political and social divisions in the US are appalling. Donald Trump is only a symptom of a very, very deep schism within the United States about what the country is for and who it's for. And my feeling is that it's going to be a long, long time before they work this out, if they ever do in any normal way. And I think that the political and social situation has a long way downhill to go before they reach a point where they see that they have to make a solution to sustain the country. So I don't think that we as a country, we can't depend on the US in the way that we have in the past. And that means we have to build a new set of alliances. It means we have to re-examine what our national interests are and what are our essential core values. And I think one of the things that we're going through in these reactions to not only what's happening in China, but also what's happening in Hong Kong, is that we are establishing relationships with like-minded middle powers. It's one of the reasons why I think in terms of Asia, we should be focusing our trade and political efforts on what is now called the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. It used to be called just the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This is us and 11 other countries in Asia and indeed in Latin America, includes Chile. So it's Pacific Rim. Does not include China, it doesn't include the United States, but it is still a very, very significant free trade area that also includes many aspects, not only of how you do trade, how you deal with one another. So it's an association of values as much as it is an association of business. And this, I believe, is where we should be focusing our efforts in Asia. It includes countries like Australia, like Japan. It doesn't include at the moment South Korea, but it will. It ought to include Taiwan. It includes Singapore, Indonesia, New Zealand, and several other, as I said, it includes Chile. And these are countries with whom we need to form our alliances in the coming years. Well, we have alliances already with some group, but we need to put much more emphasis on our relationship with like-minded countries and not deal with countries like the PRC with whom we share no common interests at all. So I think that these reactions, even though they may not bring any response from China, from the People's Republic of China, they do help us build a new community of like-minded countries, which is what we're going to need, in my view, in the future.
One more question from the same person. Given Hong Kong's political and social progression, can we hope that religion will someday be respected in Hong Kong?
Well, religion is respected in Hong Kong at the moment, but is it? I mean, I think the question is now that the one country, two systems is over, and the rule of law is over, and I think that we can easily foresee a situation in the coming months when religion and religious observance in Hong Kong is treated in the same way as it is on the mainland. I don't think that looks very hopeful at the moment. I mean, also, there have been many organizations in Hong Kong that have sustained the religious organizations, the underground religious organizations in the mainland. I mean, I remember when we lived there, the guy who used to service and look after my computers, and this is the early days of the internet and of computer communication and so forth. He was involved with an evangelical Protestant church, and one of the things he did was to restore old computers that people had worn out of and sneak them into China to be used as part of communications network with underground churches. So there's a whole network of organizations in Hong Kong sustaining churches in China. I would think that that's going to become more and more difficult in the coming months. And where it goes from there, I don't know. I'm sure that those organizations will try to find another place where they can have reasonable access to China, but that's getting more and more difficult as the technological authoritarian state is put in place. That said, as I've already said, I think that if religiously observant people are prepared to recognize that the ultimate authority in their lives is the Chinese Communist Party, they will be allowed to survive. But of course, not everyone is happy with that compromise.
Another quite different question. You had mentioned Canada being 47th of the nations relatively dependent on China. Which would be in the top 3 dependent on China?
I can't remember offhand, and I'm not sure if I've got the paper handy. I don't think I do. Certainly within the top 10 were countries like Australia. And this is interesting from Canada's point of view. Australia has taken a much more assertive reaction, or made a much more assertive reactions to PRC than we have over the questions of intrusion and influence within Australia and intimidation of Australians. And they've done that even though they are way, way more dependent on exports to China than we are. And I think that we actually have quite a lot to learn from Australia. One of the things that they've done, and this is another thing that we should do, is that they've introduced a law regulating and governing and giving them legal recourse against foreign political organizations working in Australia. We should do the same thing. The problem we have with that, and while there would be resistance to it, is of course there are a heck of a lot of American political organizations that work in Canada one way or another, in various ways, both of left and right. So I think that there'll probably be some reluctance in Ottawa in introducing a law which we would aim at controlling PRC organizations here, but which it actually could American organizations. We'd probably get a lot of blowback from that, I think. But yeah, no, the major countries who are dependent on trade with China were mostly the countries surrounding China, the countries of Southeast Asia. But I do remember that certainly in the top 10, there was Australia was one.
Thank you. It's getting almost close to 12:30 now, and I have one last question for you. Human rights watch groups were very important in the communist Eastern European countries and the former USSR. what kind of human rights watch groups exist today in China?
Yeah, well, there's nothing like the Helsinki Accord. The Helsinki Accord gave Western European organizations a sort of formal insight into human rights in the Soviet bloc. There's nothing like that with China. There are a lot of human rights organizations of various sorts operating mostly out of Hong Kong. We have nothing like the Helsinki. I mean, I think one has to remember that the Soviet Union in the mid to late 1980s, and certainly under Gorbachev was trying to propel an internal political reformation. He was prepared to abandon the one-party state and indeed the Soviet Empire, and so he was prepared to use Western human rights organizations to help him manage his domestic political agenda. There's nothing like that in China. But the Chinese Communist Party has examined minutely what happened in the Soviet Union and Russia and Eastern Europe in the 1980s and 90s. And that essentially is their disaster scenario. That is what they intend to avoid at all costs. And so, they are not going to allow significant activities by human rights organizations in China. They're even locking up lawyers who have the temerity to try to defend people the Communist Party wants to put in prison. Many of those lawyers were trained by Canada. We spent $1 billion, billion dollars on a training scheme for Chinese lawyers and judges. We tried to teach them about the rule of law and an independent judiciary and all these sort of things. And the poor lawyers who took this seriously and thought that the rule of law and an independent judiciary was a good idea have found themselves locked up in large numbers because that's not on the agenda of the Chinese Communist Party. So if I sound overly pessimistic, I'm sorry, but it's hard to see much light at the end of the tunnel at the moment. And I think that we have to look to our own situation and try and bolster our defenses as much as we can, because I think there's a bit of a rough road ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan, for all of your knowledge and insights. And at this time, I want to turn over the floor to our president, Michael Goko. I think he's going to be coming in again. You there, Michael?
Thank you very much, David. Thank you for your excellent questions.
Thank you. Before I close the event, if I can just, for one last time, invite Jonathan back on the floor, and just in case you have any more upcoming activities or talks, or if you want to promote your book, put it up on the screen, feel free to do so. And where we can purchase it, just go ahead and let us know.
It should be in your bookstores now. There we are.
All right, thank you very much, Jonathan, for being with us this morning, and we are hoping that you will come back to grace us with your presence at another time. Thank you as well to Dr. Klassen for leading the questions, and for our audience members who came to be with us this morning, and those who asked the many burning questions that we have seen for sure. As always, more information about the Newman Association of Vancouver can be accessed through our social media pages and our email list. Information on membership and donations should also be seen on the chat now. We have various weekly faith formation activities, among other things, for membership that you might be interested in joining.